now. Okay, good. Okay, I'm going to screen share the slides, and hopefully, can you now see the slides? Good, some nodding. Right, I'm going to actually turn off my little head and shoulders of everybody. So if you want to make a point or want to ask me about something, then unmute and ask me. Otherwise, I won't necessarily spot you. Okay. Right, this is me. I'm Caro Hart. I'm the community training consultant for Dorset Community Action. And this training course is part of a new module we're just launching, from evidence to impact, which is the whole range of monitoring and evaluation, from your basic needs analysis right up to measuring impact and reporting to funders. And it's one of 7 forthcoming modules as part of what we're calling the DCA Academy. And these will be launched over the next few months with a big sort of coordinated launch in December. So this is one of the very first courses that we've done under the DCA Academy. And what we're going to cover today is going from the basics. What are monitoring and evaluation? And you may have also heard of things like targets, outcomes, deliverables, outputs. I'm hoping to try and demystify those for you. And also looking at what's the difference between the stats and stories and how those can both be used. How you, what methods you can actually use to monitor the data you want to collect, and how you put that into a plan. And then once you've collected all that lovely data, how do you evaluate it? How do you tell qualitatively what's happened? And then I'm hoping that one or more of you will have a challenge that you're experiencing in this area that we can discuss to think about some of the things we've learned. And then I'll give you some useful links and other resources following on from this. If at any point you want to ask a question, please just yell. We're a small group. I don't mind going off down the odd tangent as we go. So, what are monitoring and evaluation? As you can see here, monitoring is just the collection of stuff, often called raw data. It's the process of observation, without at this stage drawing any conclusions, making any judgments about what you're seeing. And at its purest, it is being open to seeing not only what you expect to see, but what isn't there. And always it's a process of watching the story of what you're doing go from chapter to chapter. An evaluation is the next stage. Once you've got all this raw data, the stories and the stats and so on, it's about drawing conclusions, comparing your targets to what happened, and making, as I've said here, a value judgment about whether it was successful. And picking up on those unintended consequences that you've seen out of the corner of your eye, and thinking about what they mean and how they've affected what has happened. And it could be that you find some really big gains there to take you forward to the next bit of work. Now, I mentioned targets, deliverables, and outcomes. So targets are specific goals, usually in numbers, and I've given some examples there. But they can be time-bound, they can be specific measurable things that are not numbers, but they are usually some form of number. A deliverable, otherwise known as an output, is something tangible or sometimes less tangible that is produced and that you knew was going to happen. So that would be a report or a study or an analysis. It could be something online that you were launching, or even a full-on product or service. The less tangible ones are things like systems development or new knowledge coming into the organisation. And they can be anything from a small change in what you're doing to a really big change. And I've given the example here of organisational culture. Usually, we say that all of these have to be phrased in such a way that they are specific, they are measurable, they are achievable, may also be aspirational. You can resource them. It's no point in making a plan that involves giving every child in Dorset a guinea pig if there just aren't that many guinea pigs. Time bound, and that is in some ways is the most important. You have to have a time frame for that delivery. And for me, I mean, I'm sure you've seen many different types of model. They have to be agreed. People have to have reach consensus on what you're aiming for as part of this piece of work. So let me just stop sharing for a second and put this back onto you. What sorts of monitoring are you familiar with that you've come across? And do they bear any resemblance to what I've just said?
Well, I'm familiar with outcome monitoring, impact monitoring. Yeah, impact monitoring and outcome monitoring. Those are the two major monitoring and evaluation that I do most times.
Okay. And what sorts of targets or deliverables do you work with?
Well, most times I work with the SMART. That is the SMART. That is one is specific, time bound, measurable. Like those are the major. Those are my major guidelines. So from there, I'm able to develop the outcomes that I believe will
follow on. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any examples? Sam?
Yeah, we've been as you know, we've been creating outcomes since last October when we took on more staff, and we recorded statistics and the sort of things that our clients met. You know, increased socialization and all sorts of different things. We were able to use that to put to our lottery grant, and we'll be using those as a baseline going forward to meet our targets under the lottery grant.
Okay, so give us an example. You said about increased socialization. How did you measure that?
We've got a Christchurch. We've got various different services, and we specialise in trying to work with people that are socially isolated. So there's different schemes that we've got telephone friendships groups, so people that are on their own are now socialising with groups of people on the phone. We have Christchurch Angels where they go out and befriend people and try and get them back into the community. Perhaps they're bereaved or they've been ill. And also the transport, getting people out to lunch clubs and things like that.
So you measure the number of people,
yes,
engaging with those services. Do you have a measure of how they're feeling about it?
We've done a small measure about that, and the telephone friendship group is the one that's done the most on that side of things. But no, that's something we need to do more of.
Yeah, I'm cheating a little bit because I know the answer to that. I've been working with CCP. So anybody else? What's your experience been? Helen?
Hi. So I write applications for trusts and foundations, and then obviously have to do the reporting on any grants that we receive. So usually our measures are things like the number of activities or sessions delivered, the number of people attending, the number of attendances over a period of time, before and after surveys, observations from staff and volunteers, quotes and stories from service users, and wellbeing assessments by the wellbeing coordinator, which is done at the start, through interim in their treatments and at the end of their treatments. So when we do the surveys before and after, we'll ask them how they felt, and we'll have things like 98% of service users said that they felt less lonely or felt less anxious, and so we can actually see how it's making them feel by attending those sessions.
Brilliant. No, that's absolutely fantastic. Sounds like you do a really wide range of things, and I want to get you talking on that in a moment or two. I just wonder if Sheila or Sarah, have you got any comments on where you're at with this?
Hi, it's Sarah,
Hi, Sarah.
here.
Hi.
Hello, everyone. Yes, well, so just to put it into context, we're a very small organisation, so I'm the only full-time member of staff, and we run groups, activity groups for older people that are dementia-friendly groups. So not everyone has dementia, but a fair proportion of people do. And I'm here because I realise that monitoring and evaluation is an area in which I'm sadly lacking, because I'm trying to do everything. I'm the fundraiser, I run the groups, I organise the groups, you know, I make sure the lunches are prepared and all the rest of it. So it can be something that I sort of start to feel slightly uncomfortable when we begin to talk about it, because I realise that I'm on the back foot, but I do realise how important it is, otherwise I wouldn't be here.
No. Oh, thank you for that. No, that's really I'm just reading Sheila's projects that have no evidence of need and very little evaluation. So yes, I think that echoes what Sarah's just said. So good. So I'm going to screen share again. Do yell at me if you don't see the screen. Right, outcomes. You mentioned this, Emmanuel. An outcome can be defined as what you hope will happen overall. And you may have think that actually I've started backwards. I've started with the lower levels of stuff, the targets and the deliverables, and now we're looking at the overarching stuff. But there is a reason to my madness, and part of it is to emphasize that actually this is how a lot of people design their projects. And as Sarah said, there is always so much to do that actually monitoring and evaluation or monitoring, it comes very far down the list. and that is totally understandable. The trouble is, if you get a load of data and then sit down at the end and think about what your outcomes are and how you want things to turn out and what you want to measure, you may or may not have that data. I did a piece of work for an organisation you may have heard of, Cruise, and they'd done a project on bereavement, 5-year projects funded by the NHS, and it was quite highly funded as well. Unfortunately, they'd had 4 different project managers in that 5 years, and each one of them had decided to measure different things. And so I was handed this basket of apples and oranges and pears and asked to create a final report out of them. I managed it, but it's not a good position to be in. So actually, the important thing to say about the outcome is that that's got to come first. And for the rest of what we're going to be looking at, it will come first. Okay, are there any questions so far? Okay, cool.
Can
Right.
I, sorry.
Yeah, go on.
I was late to the party there with unmuting. When we are such a small organisation as we are, and one person basically tries to do everything, can we get actual help from an actual person who actually knows what they're doing, rather than trying to stumble through it ourselves?
Yes, is the easy answer, and I'll come back to this a bit more at the end. But the short answer is yes. It's perfectly reasonable to get somebody involved at the beginning, hopefully, or of the project to help you to set this up. Emmanuel, did you have a point?
Yeah, no. I'm just trying to acknowledge what you said. Yeah, because most times when I also started as an M&E officer, I faced a series of challenges. I had to reach out to colleagues. Hey, I really need your help. Please, can you put me through? Especially when it comes to evaluation and gating of data. So it's always possible to seek for help.
Yeah, there might be help within the organisation. You may find one of your trustees or one of your volunteers has some prior experience. Hire somebody by all means if you can to perhaps come in now and again, or an organisation like DCA to come and set it up in a way that it then runs itself. I mean, I hope as what you'll take from today is that it doesn't need to be this big complicated thing. It can be very light touch and just built into your operation. I ran a older people's clubs for a very multicultural mix of people, not all of whom wrote in English and could have filled in a questionnaire. So what we did was we had flip charts by the doorway as people were leaving, and everybody had a little row of stickers, a smiley to frowny stickers, and they just put that on the flip chart as they left. So you got a rough measure how people were feeling about that day, and over the months those flip charts sort of added up. But let's look at the kind of data that's out there. So there's the statistics I've spoken about, and those can be direct. We've spoken about the number of people who use a service, which quite often you've monitored accidentally anyway, if you've got a sign-in sheet, especially at the moment, or if you've got the number of lunches that you had to prepare, you've got a number. You don't have to go out and do another count. Whether you're just having a chat with people or whether you're doing anything more formal, you could get a number, as Sam said earlier, of how many people are happy with the service. You can also get useful statistics sort of as a one-off thing, often indirectly. So when you look back at the year, the people you've bought, the venues you've used, or the people you've bought your supplies from, if are they all local businesses? Are they all BCSE organisations, perhaps? Or you could do a one-off look at, you know, do your staff live locally, or are they are the majority of your staff have they been long-term unemployed, or whatever is appropriate. There's also the stories, and you can it's good to measure those as you go along. If you invite people to write in, or you may get thank you letters spontaneously. I know CCP do. People just send thank you letters. Keep them, they're lovely, they're wonderful. But you may also reflect back on something else that happened and tell the story of how that came about. Okay. Right, let's have a little look. In your workbooks, you've got a case study of Stout and Elders Club. And this bears no resemblance to any group, living or dead, I hasten to add. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to divide you in groups, and I want you to think about that question: how can Stoughton set targets for their new service? And having set targets, how can they measure them? Okay. Right, I'm going to randomize you into 2 little groups, so you can have a little chat, and if you have any problems, there should be a button to come back to the main area. Okay, that's fine. This will be for about 8 minutes. Okay. Sorry about this. We seem to have one breakout room. Okay. Okay. Cool. Lovely. You're back. Fantastic. Right. Okay. Right. So how was that? Where's Emmanuel?
Good. Did he leave meeting rather than leave room?
Oh, I hope not.
He might come back in a minute.
Hopefully. Okay. Yes, it's easy enough done. So, what were your conclusions about the deliverables and targets that Stoughton Elders Club should be monitoring against those outcomes?
Sarah, do you want to go with your one first, the baseline?
Okay, thanks, Helen. I was going to say I nominate Helen because she seems to be so sensible and know what she's talking about. Anyway, yeah, we thought that there could be a baseline form to assess how people are when they come to the service. So how maybe how lonely they are, you know, how often they see people every week, how they feel in themselves. Do they feel isolated? Do they feel close to people? Do they feel supported? Do they take part in any physical activity? And then we could use that to also inform the service as to, you know, maybe we were talking about putting in some seated exercise or it's something more vigorous depending on the people to make sure that we're then hitting that target for the funders and also, well, more importantly for the people themselves. So
Deliverables, you've taken a baseline. So this is how they are when they come. So what would be the expected targets or deliverables? That they would become more active.
That you'd hope that people would become less isolated, more physically active, and feel. That's what you hope.
And what would you measure to get that information?
Well, oh God,
sorry. Go ahead, Helen.
I was going to say we're going to measure the number of attendances at the group so that we can see that they're regularly interacting socially with other people, which is going to reduce loneliness. We can also measure how if they participate in the activities, become more active, so that we would know that.
How would you measure that?
So you can measure number of attendances, participation, but you could also then do surveys to understand how they are feeling as well. So have regular, not too regular, but regular surveys.
That's a really good point, because hold on to that thought, because I've got I want to come back to that actually, that difference between subjective and objective data. Because that's really important with something like this. What other targets might you set for your work? What about involved in their communities? Does anybody have any thoughts about that?
Well, Sarah was saying in the baseline assessment is to ask those sort of questions. It is how many times do they see other people, and are they involved in any other groups, so that you can see, you know, how lonely and that they are. So then knowing that they're coming to your group is increasing their social interactions, and participating in your activities, you can see the outcomes of that.
I'd just like to add in something about, because this is quite similar to the sort of work I do actually, but in our work we have a lot of volunteers who are themselves older people, and so they have said anecdotally to me, oh, there wasn't anything for me to do, and I felt really, you know, lonely and without purpose in the community until I started doing the volunteering, and then that opens up other friendship groups, and people start to socialize then within the group as well. So that's a good thing to
you may be familiar with the 5 ways to well-being, which is to be active, to keep learning, to take notice, which is about stopping to smell the flowers, to give is one of them. So help to volunteer, to be involved in what's going on around you is really important. And the 5th one, keep learning, be active, socialize. And the theory goes that a few years ago, the New Economics Foundation did a survey of all the successful projects around social isolation and loneliness, or mental well-being as we now know it, I suppose. And the ones that worked had one or more of those 5 things in them, and the ones that went really well had all 5. And so we can all build and maintain our mental and to some extent physical well-being by having those 5 things in our lives. And I designed older people's clubs with all 5 things in a day. And you're quite right, having people volunteering, even a little buddying system with new people coming into the club gives people such a sense of purpose. Right.
One of the things we said
go on, Sam.
is looking at what is achievable with the personnel that you've got. Volunteers and staff. And then looking at what you want to achieve and how many more people you would need to achieve that. And also whether there are any other services that could help those clients and how would they benefit from them. Again, to put targets for things.
Good. Well, hold those thoughts and we'll come back to that in part 2. So for now, I'm going to share screen again. If you can't see that, Sam, then do.
No, I've got it back now. I've played around with several different buttons and got it back.
So, are you able to see that slide? Are you seeing anything other than that slide?
We are down the left-hand side, but not on the main screen.
Left-hand, not. Are you seeing all the little slides?
Yes.
In which case, let me just redo that. Normally it stays, but sorry. It says share screen, advanced, portion of screen. I do know how to do this. It just there, that should do it. Can you see the slide and nothing else now?
Yeah.
Good. Oh, thank God for that. Right. So we've talked about a lot of this a moment ago. You've talked about how you might measure positive changes to health, well-being, mental health. Numbers, if one of your targets is getting more volunteers, for example, and we've talked about the numbers engaging with a service or with a website or an online resource. Logically, if one of the outcomes was a report or a document, the actual deadline when that was completed would be a perfectly good monitoring method. Now, in the last bit of that, I've mentioned the Warwick Edinburgh mental wellbeing scale. Has anybody come across that? No. Okay.
We have through you with
yes.
working with the CCP and the lottery grant.
Yeah.
Just to put that in. So as I've been doing outcomes, I need to look at that.
Yes. I mean, basically what that does is it looks at exactly what you've been talking about, the level of social isolation. And it's good because it has a statistical validity, because it has been developed to actually give reliable data. And if you use it in a number of contexts, you're measuring the same thing. Now, the important thing about these scales is to mix your techniques, because I used the Warwick Edinburgh scale and another scale out of Duke University in Australia, and we measured how lonely people felt. And we actually worked with a couple and did the measurement with each, the man, there were a man and a wife. And each of them had the same amount of social contact because they went everywhere together. They were a retired couple. And except for on a Friday when the wife went out to see her girlfriends for lunch. So she was having slightly more social contact than he was. And when we asked them how they felt about this, about whether they were lonely or felt isolated, the wife said she was desperately lonely, and the husband said he wasn't. So it's really important, because saying how many social contacts somebody has doesn't necessarily tell you whether they're feeling lonely, because isolation and loneliness, of course, are different things. And I can see something like that very much happening with me and my sister. During lockdown, I've been meeting online with my board games club. She's been meeting online with her friends. We've been Zooming with relatives, Zooming with each other. She's had a really, really hard time, felt so lonely, so isolated, and I haven't. So it's different strokes for different folks. So we also talked about how you can collect data. Yes, several of you said, we ask people what they think. Bearing in mind that is subjective and that they quite often are trying hard to please you. That is good. We've also mentioned indirectly watching what they do, seeing how they interact in a room. And we've mentioned the external outcomes frameworks like the Warwick Edinburgh scale can remove that sort of bias, which is can be very useful. So this is something I found from the NCVO. If you're not familiar with their training resource, I thoroughly recommend it. They've said that what techniques you choose depends on these things. Do you need the data to be in depth? Do you need to go below the numbers? Do you need to find out how often people came to an event and what motivated them to go to that event? And as we've mentioned, the time it takes and what skills are needed to do the monitoring is really important when you're deciding whether to do a light touch, an occasional, or a constant form of monitoring. It's got to be appropriate to your organisation. There are loads and loads of really very expensive monitoring systems out there, but for a small startup organisation, they're just not appropriate. And how reliable they are. You don't want to discover a year down the line that actually sometimes you've had the data and it seems pretty good, and sometimes you haven't, and try and work out whether you've actually got what you needed. And then really above all of those, it's how sensitive the issues are. You know, it may be sort of another day at the office for you, running a club, having fun, seeing people have fun. But actually for a new person coming in, that might be really, really hard. And so actually talking to them on day one about how lonely they've been, how socially isolated they are, may be very off-putting for them. So you have to balance all of these needs out. I've also mentioned there at the bottom the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulations, which apply to us all. That is as a result of the Data Protection Act 2018, and I'm sure you're familiar with that. And that lays a requirement on all of us to really think about why we're collecting data, and is it the right way of going about things? Why are you collecting the data? What is your lawful basis for doing so? And then each organisation has to think about how they store and then ultimately dispose of that data. And if you're working with vulnerable people or children, you have to think about it even more closely, and you have to have a written document justifying why you're collecting that data, how you're keeping it secure, and when you're going to dispose of it. So that is another big issue for a lot of organisations when they're thinking about monitoring in that respect. So are there any questions at this point? All right, I'll carry on then. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was designing a monitoring system. Now, bearing in mind what we've just said about it being proportionate for your organisation, for it being sensitive to the user's needs, the fact remains that it is good practice to monitor what's going on. And having started from the point of view of the outcome, what is the overall thing you're trying to produce? And as we've just done for Stout and Elders Club, you then break that down into the more specific targets, and added to each one of those an indicator, a measure, a sort of endpoint, if you like. And we started thinking about how the data will be collected, by whom. And to make a plan, you need to have thought through all of these, including, as I've just said, the GDPR. So a plan might look like this. And this is obviously quite a brief version. I've taken the first of the outcomes that the funder set down. Or part of the first, in fact, no, it's the second one, sorry. People become more physically active, increasing mental and physical well-being. So the deliverables I've stuck on there are that people join in with activities, and the point we picked up on earlier, half of them do more activities outside the club than they did when they started. So then you go to the next step. How will that be measured? And what I've suggested under the indicators is that when somebody's joining in with an activity, that is logged in some way. There is a daily log sheet. And the activity leader or the volunteers will just tick off against the name who is joining in with that activity. Another way of doing that might be, obviously with permissions, is photographs during the event, which somebody could do weekly. And those have a number of good benefits. They not only show a whole lot of people doing seated Bhangra or whatever, or not. They may show some people sitting down watching, and that's fine, but it gives you evidence either way. The other thing I've looked at is doing more activities outside the club, and you were spot on in what you were saying. A baseline question, just as part of the sign-up process, maybe an assessment, as I know that some of you do, and actual active suggestions of other clubs they could join and so on. And that might be in conjunction with other organisations, as you said. What you might use is something like a spider diagram. So you're looking at 4, 5, 6, sometimes 8 areas which people might develop. So they might develop into volunteering, they might develop into self-confidence, they might develop their number of activities. And if you measure that before and after, you can draw a line and see how that has developed. Now, the trouble with face-to-face, one-to-one work is that it is very time-consuming. It's quite intrusive in a nice way, and it takes skills to actually do an assessment and work with somebody, or even a questionnaire. And so I've suggested here that that is done infrequently, only a couple of times a year. And one of the risks, one of the challenges that might be around with that is taking somebody aside so they can have privacy for that conversation. So that is a model which again is on the NCBO training area. There's 3 or 4 examples, worked examples of monitoring evaluation frameworks. But this is the one that I liked, that we've actually used for the Academy project, because it makes sense to me. Because if you're saying you're collecting certain data, you've got to think about how you're going to collect that data, who's going to do it, and when. And it makes good business sense to look at identifying risks or challenges to that process. Are there any questions on that?
One thing I would say about photographs is that you need to get permission under GDPR.
Yes.
You can either do that as individuals, which we do if we've got taken photographs of individuals, small groups. If it's an event, you can have on the login a tick box for it, or you can put a notice up saying that we may be taking photographs if you don't wish to be notified, whoever.
Yeah,
there are things under photographs that you need to comply with.
Yeah, absolutely. As there are, as I've mentioned with the sort of GDPR, particularly if you're going to save data from somebody's one-to-one, so you've got their personal data, maybe about health or I don't know, sexual orientation or something, which is classified as particularly sensitive data. So let's do the second part of this. Again, that's in your workbook. And I've put the same little grid that you've just seen in your workbook. Let me just stop sharing. There we go. And I'd like you to try and fill in one of those rows. Let's do this as an individual exercise to give you a chance to think things through and sort of base it on one of the deliverables or targets you were talking about in group. So is everybody okay with that? Are you fine with, you know, what you're doing? Well, I should be here if you're not, okay? So we'll take about 5 or 6 minutes, fill in at least one of the lines along. Okay, do you want a little bit more time, or shall we discuss where we're up to? Don't forget to unmute. Okay, well, that's cool. So, does somebody want to give a deliverable, say what indicators, and then go along the line? Sam.
I've got a couple of things. Reduced isolation. The indicators are how often they get out to the Stoughton clubs, how often they get out to other activities, both at the starting point and perhaps a certain time later, perhaps 6 months.
So hang on. So the indicators are the number of social contacts, and the data will be collected by questionnaire.
I hadn't actually put that down, but
So how will the data be collected?
By questionnaire or by someone.
Yeah, okay. And it will be collected twice a year, you said?
I suggested it's every 6 months, but
Every
you
6
need
months.
to sort of see what improvement they've had. So if they've
Yeah.
only done one club with Stoughton, perhaps now doing 2, or perhaps doing 1 there, 1 outside, or
So
whatever.
who's going to do that?
Somebody from Stoughton.
Yeah. So that might
Or they're gonna have
be
to
the project.
appoint.
Yeah. So probably the
In our
project
case,
person.
what we do is for the different services, the project manager
Project
each month
manager. Yeah.
does that particular thing for that service, but I don't know how Stoughton will do it.
Okay. And what might be the risks or challenges?
The challenges is actually having the capability to monitor it.
Yeah. Having the capacity and the capability. And also because it's a sensitive area, isn't it? You know, people may feel that because loneliness is a difficult one. People don't like to admit they're feeling lonely, so it might be a difficult conversation to have. Good, nice. Anybody else have one? Sarah.
Okay, so I was looking at the deliverable targets as being increasing physical activities for individuals through a seated exercise program. And then the indicators would be who joins in with the seated exercise program, what do people think about it, have they noticed any personal benefits, and how can it be improved according to them. And that would be through staff observation of who joins in, but there'd have to be some kind of questionnaire type of thing to find out. Maybe they don't have to write it, so it's kept as simple as possible, just someone asking them a question, you know, what did they think about it, do they like it, have they noticed any benefits over time. And I think that the idea would be to set up a program where people learn maybe a dance routine or something, and so that they get more familiar with it over time, and perhaps then are encouraged to practice the moves at home to music or something. So it becomes their route, you know, embedding something as part of people's routine within the group.
So how often would you collect that data?
Not too often, because otherwise you drive people up the wall.
But
if you could be so at the beginning, perhaps see how many join in, and then maybe 3 months down the line, depending on how often you're doing it, and then maybe at 6 months at the end of a project, and then picking up those sort of anecdotal things of, oh, this is great, I put my music on at home and I do my funky moves that you've taught me.
So that could be picked up on a day-by-day basis by the volunteers, just talking to folk. If you encourage the volunteers to just capture those lovely little stories, that might be one way of getting a constant flow of data. I remember we did a seated yoga and at the older people's club I ran, and we did a very similar thing to what you've suggested. Kind of talked to people and asked them what difference it had made. And this lovely old lady, who was the sweetest, nicest person you could ever meet, very quiet, very shy, but joined in like a son of a gun. You know, she really loved it. And she said very quietly to the volunteer, "Well, my sex life has improved." So that's the kind of thing, the kind of wonderful story that collects. So, and again, the same risks or challenges. It can be very, very sensitive for people. You've got to have the capacity, you've got to have the capability. Emmanuel or Sheila, have you got another example, perhaps, of something you worked through? Yeah. Yeah. Yep, stickers on a board. And keeping it up during the year is definitely a challenge, because you can sample periods. Say you ran a monitoring exercise for 3 months of the year and said, therefore, over the whole year, the figures are likely to be X. You can do that, and that's perfectly valid. You have to be a little careful if the project or the activity you're doing is cyclical, if it's busier in the winter and not in the summer or something like this. You have to have a really good basis for doing that. Has anybody got any other points on this? Did that way of thinking things through work for you? Yes, some nods. Okay.
It's difficult in such a short space of time to get your head around.
It is, yes, which is why I've put it in the workbook so you can take it away and have a think about it. As I say, I've done a real life example of this for the training academy. And I mean, I think the key to it is goes back to outcomes, which is what I think, was it you, Sarah, or Helen said right at the beginning. So long as you're clear on the outcomes, then everything else to a great extent falls into place, because you'll be able to break that outcome down and say, well, okay, how will we know we've got there? And your deliverables and targets will fall fairly easily out of that. And sometimes those outcomes are set by the funder. I'm doing one at the moment where the National Lottery have funded a skate park, and they want to see people improving themselves or feeling that they've gained skills. So all you can do is ask people about that. But we're breaking it down into, have they been to a how many people have gone to the training sessions, how many people have posted on a website their new moves and things like that. So once you know, you're sure of what your outcomes are that you're trying to achieve, the rest does fall into place. So I'm going to share screen again. Yeah. Okay. So moving on to evaluation. And we always say monitoring and evaluation as if they're the same thing or they're two halves of the whole. And in fact, they're not. As we've talked about, the details of what you're monitoring, how you're monitoring it, who's doing it, when, are actually much more time consuming and challenging than actually evaluating it. So quite often evaluations, well, mostly evaluations happen at the end. Sometimes they happen in a modified form during, and that can be useful because you can see how far along the way to your final outcomes you are. But essentially, whether you're doing it at a waypoint or a milestone, or whether you're doing it at the end, the ultimate question is, did you produce the goods? What happened versus what was wanted? Did you achieve the target and or produce the deliverables? And very much following on from that was, well, why not if you didn't? Or if you exceeded them, why was that? What can we learn from that? And then the $1 million question, quite literally, was the project successful? And that is, once you've got the data, that is a relatively straightforward process. And as we talked about, what you would do is you would look at the hard evidence, the data, the statistics, the number of people. And that may be the nub of what the funder wants. The funder wants to know you've helped 200 older people, or done a web page that's been visited by 500 kids. But then if you're looking at a wider outcome, particularly where it's a value-driven one, where it's one about how people are feeling differently, then it's more important to gather the soft evidence, what people have said, how they're behaving, show the pictures of the club at the beginning with half the people sitting around the outside, and at the end when everybody was up there dancing. And then you compare the targets with the actuals. And that's usually a yes/no answer. Did you achieve the targets? Did you produce the deliverables to the time frame that was wanted? Usually yes or no. And when you're using an outcomes framework, it's always worth just sticking in your report why you use that and what the scientific basis for their accuracy and validity is. And then, you remember I said at the beginning that when you're in the monitoring phase, you keep your eyes open. You look at other things that happened. I worked for one charity that did weekend visits for international students in British homes. And we had 2,000 families around the country who occasionally or regularly would have a visitor, and students could say where they wanted to go in the country and so on. And so we've got loads and loads of statistics and people giving feedback saying how wonderful it was and how welcome they felt. But we also had 2 marriages, which was very unintended. It wasn't a dating service. We had one marriage between the student and the son of the host, and we had one marriage between 2 students who'd been placed in the same weekend. So that makes a lovely story. So but you can also look at the larger context, and often you're actually asked were there any economic benefits. Increasingly funders are using the Social Value Act, so looking at the economic benefits, the environmental benefits and the social benefits of your project. And although they may not be the core measuring your project, it may put you in very good stead for your next bit of funding to notice those things. So can you identify the change that the work has made? And if it didn't, were those internal factors or external factors? And again, if you were able to exceed what you thought you were going to do, so instead of people are more involved in their communities, actually 2 of the people stood for the parish council to help lead their communities. Why did that happen? Was it the talk you had from the local parish councillor? You know, what was it that made that change? And then look inside. What was the learning from what happened, whether it was success or failure? What can you learn from your organisation? We mentioned about staffing levels. Well, was one of the factors that actually, if you're going to run a lunch club, instead of 1 staff member and 3 volunteers, actually need a lot more volunteers. That could be a really important learning for designing your next piece of work. And particularly from the unintended consequences, that can be a lot of learning. I gave an example earlier about a project where they made a partnership with the local school. And that was really to help the older people to volunteer as readers, to help children to learn to read. But actually they landed up with this superb intergenerational thing going on, which wasn't intended. And then again, the $1 million question, can you do it again? Could you reproduce those outcomes? Now, I've mentioned a few of the useful links and resources, and I've given them here as well, and you will get these slides. And I mentioned the Warwick Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale. It has some variations depending on whether you're using it across cultures, whether you're using it across age groups, and so on. There's loads of stuff around measuring mental well-being in children and young people as well. And I mentioned the 5 ways to well-being. And there are also quite a lot of, if you're working with social care, there are a lot of evaluation and monitoring frameworks involved in social care, and you might come across a specific one. So I'm going to stop sharing. One of the things I said we would do towards the end of this course was to look at specific challenges that you've got in your work. And so, sorry, I'm just looking at messages. Yeah, some of the specific things that happen in your current projects, or whether you have any ongoing evaluation you've been asked for by a funder, be useful to discuss it. And I'm quite happy to hear what you've got to say about your challenges, and perhaps the group can contribute to some of that thinking.
One of the challenges we had, we set up a new service, which was, we were setting up before the pandemic, of telephone friendship groups for people that couldn't or didn't want to get out. And so they could speak to each other. And there was a lead person from the organisation, volunteer, that would lead the group. Then we hit the pandemic. And of course, we were mailing information out to surgeries, different groups, and things, asking them to nominate people to set up groups. We weren't getting the response because people were either closed down or they were busy doing other things. So that was one of the constraints we found. The groups that we did set up were very successful within themselves, but we found some of the people that referred weren't willing to go down that route. But one of the knock-on effects that we found from that was getting to know people's problems in more detail and being able to refer them on either they were doing the telephone friendship group or not, we were referring them on to either our other services or services provided by other people, or just giving them some sort of advice to help themselves. So although we weren't successful in the numbers, we were successful in we were successful for the numbers that we did have, and we had, you know, some knock-on effects that we hadn't anticipated.
And were you able to put monitoring systems in place for the other work you were doing, for the signposting and the advice work?
Yes, what I did when we started doing outcomes in October last year, I went through a lot of different, both hours that we had previously, which were basically for Christchurch Angels, which didn't encompass everything that we were doing. So I looked at other organisations, what sort of things they were collecting. And I did a big long list of things, which I sent out to them, to the project leaders, and said, well, pick the ones that are relevant to you to record monthly. And that actually meant they'd got some, oh yes, I can do 2 for that, 3 for that, whatever. So it was quite a simplistic thing. But also I said, well, if you have other outcomes, you can add them. And also we had stories coming back from the different things. So although there was a mighty panic about how it was going to affect them, once the project leaders actually got the list and picked the ones that were relevant to them, oh, it's quite easy. But obviously we do need to do some of the projects, like the telephone friendship group, are very easy to get personal feedback. Some of the other things that we do, transport and things, is not so easy. Other than the person, like neighbour cars, I do that. I take somebody to somewhere. I took a couple who were in their 90s, dropped them off, parked the car, went back in, found they'd been given iPads to update their medical information.
Oh, good.
And they said, what are these and what do we do with them? So if they were a normal taxi service, they wouldn't have got any assistance, but I sat down and did it with them. And those are the sorts of stories that we're getting back from.
Yeah, and that you need to capture.
On to our services.
Yeah. So how would you insert? I don't know if Sheila or Sarah have got any suggestions. How would you make sure that you consistently collect those little stories? Any ideas?
We do a monthly collection of data because we have a management meeting monthly, or most months, and the project leaders feedback to that, and then I do a quarterly report from those.
Okay,
I don't
that's
compile
good.
the stories, somebody else puts all the stories together, but I compile the stats.
Okay. What about so presumably it's ad hoc, whether the staff member or volunteer members to tell somebody about that story?
Yeah. We do go out looking for stories sometimes, but we get a lot of stories just come back to us and thank you letters and
It's good.
and things. So, but we do need to do more about getting face-to-face
Systemizing it a little bit. Yeah. Okay, good. Any other thoughts, Sarah?
Sorry, it took me a while to unmute. Yeah, I mean, the reason that I'm here is because I know that we get so many stories and so many good things are happening, but it's to be able to put it into a tangible form for funders, really, to show them the impact that you are having on people that's beyond the stories. And so I think because we're a new organisation, we only started in January 2019, and then COVID affected everything as it did everyone. And now we're just getting back to our activity groups that we were set up to run in the first place. So in order to go for those larger, more substantial pots of funding, I'm going to need to up my game on this front because, you know, we know everyone's having a great time. People's lives are being changed by what we do, and improved, but it's proving it and showing it. You know, we do have the photos, we have very active social media and a good website, which is also really important, I think, to show people the evidence of what you're doing. But I need to sort of strengthen that kind of data arm that is not my natural forte.
Yes. I mean, I think in terms of collecting stories, I've seen a number of really good ways of doing that, actually. And it varies from the thank you letters. You encourage people to actually send thank you letters. You could do the have cards lying around, sort of with help us make this service better, compliments, complaints, and just have them where the people are. And so people might pick them up and write on them and pop them in a little post box on their way out. Video diaries, particularly if you're working with younger people, getting people to do a little talking head into their phone is really, really good. And you wouldn't perhaps do that all the time, but you might have a campaign to say, you know, what's your message at Christmas for us? Record us a little thing and send it in, and with your permission we'll put it on social media or something. That can be really, really strong. I mean, we've talked about questionnaires, and you'll have gathered that my personal view of questionnaires is somewhat dubious, because I think it doesn't always give straight data, because if you ask people, they try and give the right answer. You have to work really hard, and hence use the Warwick Edinburgh and those which have no bias to try and get that information. And also, it's so boring, and actually they want to come and have fun, or they want to be talking to other people. So the most I would do is the sort of outcomes measure, which is basically saying to somebody, on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident do you feel at this point in time, or how engaged do you feel, or something fairly concrete. With the bereavement project I was talking about, we looked at whether people felt able to cope, whether they were managing their finances, whether they were meeting other people, and so on a scale of 1 to 10. And then you just you plot that against 4 or 5 axes, and then draw a thing around us. That's why it's called a spider diagram. And then on another occasion, you ask them, scale of 1 to 10, how are you feeling with your confidence or whatever, and you get a different line. That's one way of doing it. There are many ways of doing it, and it's quite a light touch way of doing a questionnaire. But you can also use indirect measures, observations, talk to the friends and family, carers, and so on. For capturing the stories, you can also, particularly if it's the volunteers who are picking up on them or staff, I don't know if you've come across the Microsoft Office suite has I forget what it's called. It's like Facebook, little social media thing, and you can use that just internally and get people to upload photos and little stories and so on there, and it's private within your organization, and it can be really powerful. You know, everything from the cat that wandered in the middle of the dancing to the cake that somebody brought for their friend's birthday to you know, everything in between, and it collects them all in one place like a Facebook stream, and that can work quite well. other than that, it's just a question of making sure all of your staff and all your volunteers have a clipboard or a notebook or something like that to just at the end of every day just note down, you know, so and so said to me that, or when we were talking about having more yoga, somebody said that their hips were hurting less or something like that. Try and just get everybody in the habit of filling in the day book, and that can really work. And then somebody's got to go through that all and saying, actually, you know, so and so said they joined a new club and so on. So be creative, think outside the box and think light touch. I would say there is definitely a place for questionnaires, and as we were talking earlier, at the beginning of when somebody's just joined you or just after when they've just joined you is a good time to do some sort of an assessment if you have the capacity and the capability, because that gives you a baseline. But you can always do that halfway through by asking somebody, compared to this time last year, how do you feel about? And that will give you a measure of movement. I mean, it's a bit difficult to talk about CCP because I'm going to be working with you and we're going to be talking about some of these challenges. So, and what Sheila said about the stickers on a board, very much the difficulty is making sure that's every day, every time. So you do have a good measure. Okay, well, because we're quite a small group, all of the exercises and everything have taken less long, but it's been really good. So I'll just show you a couple of last slides, or one last slide. I've mentioned the links and resources. I will send the slide pack round. Also wanted to draw your attention particularly to the course You Can't Measure Smiles, which will be looking at in a little bit more detail the process of impact measurement. Of course, it starts with monitoring and evaluation, but we'll take the next step. And also in March, we'll be looking at reporting to funders, you know, how best to put all this information into a report. And we're going to be launching some online resources, including 10-minute tips. And we'll ask you to note that we do try and get all of our courses as free as possible. So when we ask you to pay, it's because we need to cover our costs rather than make vast amounts of profit, although that would be nice. So are there any other questions that anybody's got? I've given you an awful lot of detailed information and I appreciate that. Thank you for staying with it. Thank you for your contributions to the exercises. I'll send the slides out to you probably just now, and the recording, I know Helen had to go, the recording will be available probably the beginning of next week, because I'm going to need to talk to a colleague of mine about the technicalities of that. So any other final questions or anything anybody wants to ask? Okay, well, thank you very much for coming. Have a lovely rest of your day. I'm now heading down to Dorset. So thank you, Sheila. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I will see you soon. Okay.
Well,
bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank
See
you.
soon.
All right, bye-bye.